you're holy. This might surprise you, this next question that I'm going to ask you. Hands up, who has ever been to a livestock market in this place? Oh, come on, that's not bad. Yes, I'm looking around and there are plenty of hands that have gone up in the room. Some haven't. We'll pray for you later. How dare you, living in a rural community like Brecon and never been to a livestock market. But there are certain things that are etched into your memory if you have ever been to a livestock market in the past. Though one of them is, of course, the noise. You know, there are sheep bleating left, right and centre. There might be cattle, there might be other animals. And then you've got the sound of the auctioneer that's going 250, 250, 250 or something like that. I don't know what he's really saying. But it's coming out of his mouth like a rate of knots. And you've got the noise. And of course, there are other things that are ingrained in your memory and in your mind if you go to a livestock market before. And I had the... You're going to think I'm crazy, but once I took my wife Gemma on a date to a livestock market. hang on. And so listen, she'll probably need praying for later, so if you want to pray for her, please do. She needs all help that she can get me married to me. So yeah, and the thing that we noticed when we got home, I said, you know, did you enjoy that? And she said, well, there was one thing about it that I'll never forget, Rob. And she said, well, there was the smell, obviously. And I said, what smell? What smell? And what's that? I don't know what the smell was, what the problem was. And some of you will be like me, what smell when you go to a livestock market? And that's kind of my way of introducing my topic this morning on the nativity story and moving on to the shepherds. Because if there are a group in the nativity story, and if you just put that slide up, that PowerPoint, that would be great. If there's a group in the nativity story that are my favourite, it is definitely the shepherds. Maybe it's because we live in rural Wales. Maybe it's because we, every time I go out the door, look out the window, there are sheep there. But it's the shepherds really that connect with me. Maybe it's the ordinariness. Maybe it's because I live in Wales. Maybe it's because I'm Welsh. Maybe it's because I've been to a farmer's market before. Who knows? But it's definitely the shepherds for me. And in verse 8 that Angie read earlier of Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, she told the story of the shepherds and how they visited Jesus and how they had this encounter. And one of the reasons that I love the shepherds, not just because of living in Wales, but it's really because they were so ordinary. And it says in that verse 8, it says, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flock. In other words, the shepherds in the nativity story were just doing ordinary things. They were going about their business. They were turning up to their work. They were earning a wage. They were regarded as the lowlife in the society at the time. They would have probably been out on their hillsides for weeks at a time with the sheep. And a little bit, as Gemma connected with the smell of that livestock, they would have had a smell around them as well. They were just being with each other. They were ordinary Joes doing life. They didn't have have the wisdom of the wise men. They didn't have the academic experience that could study the stars in the sky that would lead them to a Saviour. All they had, folks, was all they had. All they had with them was their sheep, their clothes, not much else. And I sometimes wonder, what qualified them to be part of the nativity story? What qualified them to be part of the greatest story that was ever told? But the story writers are in Luke's Gospel doesn't really give us much more background than that. He doesn't say why they got in. He doesn't say their qualifications. He doesn't give us a reason why they got in on the story. But all we know is that they were normal people, showing up to their work each day, showing up to another day in the office, showing up with all their problems, showing up with all the smell that went with working with animals. And yet they, the lowly shepherds, got invited into the nativity scene. You see, King Saul was a guy who was just going around his daily business. He was just going, before he was king, he was on his way looking for donkeys for his family. And as he was going on his day, as he was doing his normal routine, as he was going, looking and doing what he was meant to be doing, all of a sudden God caught up with him through the prophet Samuel, and he became anointed king. He got in on God's story, not from doing anything extraordinary, but just by being ordinary. The King David, before he was ever king, before he ever struck Goliath down, before he ever wrote the beautiful worship songs in Psalms, before he ever did anything extraordinary for God, he was out fighting lions off his sheep, fighting bears away, keeping them away from his father's herds. In other words, he was just doing the ordinary thing. He was just going about his ordinary daily business. When Samuel comes along and says, David, God has something special in store for your life. I'm going to anoint you and you're going to be king over Israel one day. He was going about the ordinary, just living. And then he was invited into a story by God that we read about in the Bible. Hey, the Apostle Paul, before he ever wrote the incredible letters to the church, before he ever did anything significant, was just on the road to Damascus, when all of a sudden a light came from heaven and God spoke to him and called him into his destiny. In other words, he was just doing the ordinary thing of living. He was just living like the shepherds. But as we read through the chapter 2 in Luke, in verse 9 it goes on and it says this, an angel of the Lord appeared to them and they were terrified. The Message version says this, suddenly something happened to these shepherds where they saw this angel and an angel spoke to them out of nowhere. And you can be living a normal life when a suddenly catches up with you. You can be living a normal routine life going to work with your family when all of a sudden suddenly comes along. You can be living when a suddenly happens and a relative is taken into hospital. You can be living and then a suddenly happens and you become terrified because you've just lost your livelihood and your job. You can be living normally when all of a sudden you get a doctor's report that you never thought that you'd have. And the world just seems to cave in on top of you. And you become terrified. We've had plenty of suddenlies in our lives over the last 2 years in lockdown. We've had COVID-19. We've had restrictions. We've had lockdown. We've had businesses closed. We've had holidays postponed. We've had churches closed. Suddenly, there are 90,000 cases of a new variant. And it's a suddenly time. And we don't know what's next. I had a rugby coach that I met at the start of lockdown, and I saw him up in town here, and he came up to me and said, Rob, all of a sudden, my anxiety levels are through the roof. And he's this big, burly guy. He's huge, and you wouldn't want to mess with him. And he's telling me, Rob, my anxiety levels are through the roof. And I'm thinking, you? This scares you? And the reality is, we can become terrified in almost an instant. We all know someone who is maybe going through a suddenly, and out of nowhere, they're terrified. Out of nowhere, they've got to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and they don't know what lies ahead. See, this is a little bit what happened to the shepherds. The shepherds were doing their ordinary business, living, and yet an angel of God appeared to them, and they were terrified. But you see, the shepherds did an incredible thing. Instead of being terrified, allowing that fear to grip them, and allowing that fear to keep them where they were on that hillside, and where most people would run. And if you're honest, when we get terrified, what is the easiest thing to do? Run. Escape. Get out of there. Turn our backs. It's the easiest and the most natural things to do when challenges come along. I want to say, many Christians run, terrified, when suddenlies come along. There's a film that's out, and there's a film, I think it's called The Runaway Bride. It's an old film, but every time the bride is about to get married, she comes up to the altar, and I don't even think she makes it to the altar. And all of a sudden, fear grips her life. And instead of stepping into her purpose, instead of stepping up into all that she can be with a relationship with her groom, instead of walking into everything that she could be, she decides to run out of the church and away from what is in store. And instead of staying the course, she runs terrified. But in the next verses, it says, it's in verse 10, it says this, the angels say to the shepherds who are on the hillside, do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Now, when we think of joy, I've got a thing. I know what comes into my head. I know what comes into my head. And it's something like that picture that was just up there. It's coming back there. There we go, there it is. Now I know that's not everyone's cup of tea here. But joy, when we get excited and experience great highlights, great moments of excitement, moments of enthusiasm and happiness, we have joy. But let me tell you, the joy that the angel was talking about is not that. Because if you're a Welsh rugby supporter, you know that doesn't last for very long. Does it? It comes around maybe once every blue moon, but we enjoy it when it does. But we're not talking about happiness. The angel speaking to the shepherds was not talking about happiness. Because in John's Gospel, chapter 15, let me go to it, verse 9, it says these words, talking about joy. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. You see, joy does not come from happiness. Joy does not come from happenings. Joy does not come from what comes into our life. But let me tell you, the Bible talks about a joy that we can have through a relationship with Jesus. And it's a life that is intertwined with Jesus so that we can experience real and lasting joy. It's a joy that comes through obeying and remaining. You know, some Christians, they don't get to experience the joy of the Lord because their faith was based on maybe a happy experience or a happy feeling. But you know, joy in our life comes through when we remain in God through tough times. When we obey his commands, when we feel like not obeying. And you read further in the New Testament, and in Galatians 5, it talks about joy being a fruit of the Spirit. Now, I don't know about you, but fruit doesn't grow overnight, does it? Fruit takes time. And I want to say, joy in our lives, joy as the angel was talking about it to the shepherds, joy in our life takes time to be nurtured. It takes time to grow in our relationship with God. If we're wanting joy in our relationship with God, we can't just pray it into being, folks. It comes through time. Dylan in our house, he loves and he's trying his utmost to grow fruit. And he's got different pots on his window. And whenever he eats some fruit, maybe it's orange or tangerine or apple, he gets the seed out of them and he sticks it in the pot, and he's got soil, and he'll water it, he'll put it by the light, and he's there trying to get it to grow. And I'm saying, Dylan, keep going, maybe it'll come. I don't want to let him down. But you know, fruit in our life, in your life and my life, the fruit of joy comes with time, but it comes through obeying God. It comes through walking with him. You know, joy in the New Testament is mentioned, joy or rejoicing is mentioned over 132 times in the original Greek. Over 100. Christianity is a religion of joy. And that's what the angels were announcing to the shepherds on the hillside. But you see, the shepherds didn't just stay there on the hillside. They went, and it says in verse 15, let's go to Bethlehem and see the thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. In other words, the shepherds, they went and they saw for themselves. They didn't take it on just the angel's word that God had come to the earth. They went and they saw for themselves. And you see, in our Christian walk, there's only so much that we can do when the pastor tells us that the baby came. There's only so much to do that you can do. There's only so far that you can go when mum and dad tell you that God is real. There's only so far that you can go when your friend talks to you about Jesus and you believe what they say. There comes a point where you have to go and see for yourself. There comes a point where you as an individual have to come and see for yourself. You know, in every walk of life, whatever you look for, do you know what? You usually find it. If you want to find a problem with your work situation, you'll probably find it. If you want to find a problem with church, you'll probably find one, folks, I'll be honest. If you want to find a party in number 10 Downing Street, you'll probably find one. You'll probably find one. But just as you can find the negative, folks, if you search for the good at Christmas time, if you search for the extraordinary in the ordinary, if you search for the Christ in the manger, let me tell you, he's there to be found. He's there to be found. And they didn't just come and see. The shepherds didn't just go and see. In verse 17 of those verses that we heard earlier, it says this: when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told about this child. And all who heard it were amazed. All who heard it were amazed. The shepherds went, they saw for themselves, but they told others. He said, if there was one thing that I could give each one of you, if there was one thing that I could pass on to each one of you, it would just be the courage, the boldness, and the faith to talk more freely about your faith. Your faith to your neighbours, to your family, to your work colleagues, to people who are lost. Can I say, I think the neighbours wonder where you go on a Sunday morning. Not just wonder where you go, wonder why you keep doing it. Why do you keep going to church? What's the point? And I'm just wondering, I would love it if everyone here just had the courage, as the shepherds did, to tell, to speak. And you know, the shepherds didn't go on a course to train them in how to tell people, how to spread the good news. They just did it out of the overflow of their hearts, because something was in them that they wanted to share with others. There was no formula, there was no plan, there was no program, but it was just something that came up out of their hearts because of the experience that they had in that stable that Christmas night. Can I give you just one thing to remember this Christmas time? One thing to remember this Christmas time. And that is that God is near. God is nearer than you think. On the hillside, the shepherds were there, and let's be honest, they were the lower of society. They weren't even allowed to testify in court because they didn't have very good reputations. They were known for lying and deceiving. But yet God showed up to them. God met them where they were. God was far nearer to them than they realized. When they weren't allowed in the temple court because of their uncleanness, God showed up. God showed up. God was nearer than they thought. When I was in isolation, when I had COVID a few weeks ago, I was there. I tried to stay in my room as much as possible, so that the family wouldn't get it. It didn't work, by the way. It didn't work. But I tried to stay in my room, and Gemma would bring me food, and every now and again they'd come and say hello to me, probably because they were feeling sorry for me. And probably the most thing that stuck with me the most at that time, Evie, she would bring her toys, and she would come and sit at the doorway of our bedroom, and she would sit down just like this, and she'd get out her cars, her toys, her Barbies, and she'd just start playing with them at the door so that I could watch her and be near to her. And that was the one thing, along with the food, that really just touched me when I was in isolation. Remember this Christmas time, folks, that God is near. Remember that He's good. Remember also that He's faithful to you in every season of life. Shall we pray?